A lot of the rest of it has been discussed piecemeal in places. What I find surprising is that there hasn't been much attempt to link it all together. Now, especially surprising is the extent to which there hasn't been an attempt to link together all the circumstances of the father's administration and his 4 years and the scandals that he was involved in at the time, because of the element of continuity between the two administrations and the extent to which George Bush Sr. kept getting involved with the Middle East. And as a result of his involvement with the Middle East, a lot of things happened. There's a lengthy set of things that he was involved with, ranging from the so-called October surprise in 1980, which is controverted, Iran-Contra, the scandal providing arms to Iran. Then George Bush Sr. was involved in Iraqgate, a scandal that New York Times columnist Bill Safire was very prominent in revealing. And Iraqgate was building up Saddam Hussein before the Gulf War. So all of this strikes me as enormously relevant to the presidency of his son, where he too gets involved in the Middle East. He too gets involved with Iraq. And you sort of wonder how all of this evolved. You also wonder how his Saudi connections either helped him to understand where to investigate before 9/11 or, in fact, handicapped him in being willing to investigate all these people who were commercially familiar to his family.
Yeah, because it seems that any one of these scandals from George Bush Sr.'s administration, the October surprise, Iran-Contra, Iraqgate, those alone should have raised enough red flags that the corporate media would have picked up on that. But
well, they didn't. There was some mention of some of these things a little bit, but there was a decision, if in fact anybody even really made a decision, to treat the second Bush as a separate entity, as somebody not flowing from his father's presidency. I think that was fundamentally mistaken. I think you had a dynasty emerging here. You had a son who was elected with his father's name, his father's connections, money from his father's friends, obviously with a set of loyalty to a lot of his father's friends and embroilment with places his father was embroiled. I think it was just a central mistake not to link these two presidencies, and for the media to have said, well, what his father did doesn't matter in analyzing his son's presidency. Again, I repeat, I don't think anybody sat down and said, this is our view, that it's not related, but I think the effect was the same, that they didn't go back and look at what that first presidency, in a sense, forecast for the second.
What about the support and or the continuity from Bush Sr. to Bush Jr. from the Republican Party's viewpoint? It seems that the current Bush administration is far more radical in a lot of its directions than the previous administration.
Well, I think that's true. As far as what George Bush would have done from 1988 to 1992, if at that point he'd had a Republican Congress, we can't know the answer because he didn't. I think it's absolutely correct to say that George W. is the most radical and right-leaning Republican president certainly since the 1920s, and it's such a change of territory that I don't think you can even analogize it back there. George W. has been radicalized on economic issues, radicalized in terms of the support he has from and gives to the religious right, and perhaps most of all, he's been radicalized on the Middle East and on Islam and on the threat that we face by 9/11. And he has said in a number of places that God was talking to him before he ran for president. He said in a number of places that he believes that he was chosen. I mean, he's reported at least to have said this by people who say that he said it, that he was chosen, that he's to lead America through this crisis, and etc. So it's an extraordinary thing. He's a metamorphosis of the Bushes, much more right-wing economics, much more unilateralist foreign policy, much more truck with a religious right, and a sense that God is talking to him. It's an extremely unusual combination.
Well, in that vein, that God is talking to him, he seems to have something in common with perhaps some strains of royalty from old Europe. Weren't many of those presented to the regular populace as being somewhat appointed by God?
Yes, the divine right of kings was an aspect. Now, I haven't heard any attempt in Washington to relate to that tradition. It probably wouldn't work too well. But you can go back and even Queen Elizabeth in the UK is still described, her title, the old one, Defender of the Faith. So that's the Church of England. The King of Spain was His Most Catholic Majesty. The King of France was His Most Christian Majesty. Be interesting if we had to come up with His Most Fundamentalist Majesty or something for George W. I don't know what you'd use. I mean, obviously, nobody's having a contest to do that, but you're quite right that if you go back and look at the monarchs in Europe, they all claim very strong ties with God and the chosenness of the royal house.
What is your take on some of the people that are currently key players in the current Bush administration, specifically Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld? My understanding was Donald Rumsfeld hadn't been a big supporter of Bush Sr. And I find it kind of interesting that then he is pulled in as a key player in the current administration.
He hadn't been a big supporter of Bush Sr. He actually had been a rival of Bush Sr. back in the 1970s. But Rumsfeld got involved during the 1990s in a lot of study groups and commissions and developed a reputation as a hardliner in foreign policy and a supporter of the missile defense system and actually a supporter of a very hard line in the Middle East. So although he hadn't been a supporter, he actually was quoted in one of Bob Woodward's books as having said back in the 70s that he thought George Bush Sr. was a lightweight, which is an interesting nuance.
And how about Dick Cheney? He also came from working somewhat in parallel with George Bush Sr.
Well, Cheney had been Secretary of Defense during the first Bush administration.